Good afternoon. It's Monday the 1st of June. So the video I did previously to this one, part 1, on preparing the floor, I started filming in the middle of April, got the floor painted, and then couldn't get hold of any materials at all. Wicks, B&Q, places like that. It's hard enough getting on their websites, let alone having anything delivered. I've sawned so I couldn't take that to collect anything, and I haven't really got anything suitable for carrying 8-foot by 4-foot sheets of materials. Fortunately, last Friday I was able to get the delivery. I've now got the insulation, or the 25mm thick insulation to go on the floor at least. I still need to get some more for other pieces of work, but I also managed to get hold of a sheet of plywood. I need one 18mm sheet of plywood for the rear of the van to replace the original piece of flooring that was there, because that's been contaminated with hydraulic fluid from a leak that the tail lift had. The rest of the flooring I'm reusing what's come out of the van. Now if you go and look at episode 5, you'll see that when I took the flooring out, it was comprised of 4 pieces of plywood, and there was also lots and lots of bits of wood underneath the sheets of plywood. And that's what I'm going to discuss next. Again, if you refer to episode 5, when I took the sheets of plywood out, you'll see that there were all these pieces of wood. Now, in order to paint the floor and prepare the floor, I'd taken all this stuff out and I'd stored it. And you've got to bear in mind that we're now almost 18 months or thereabouts since I actually dismantled the floor of this van. But I kept all this stuff because I knew it would be useful. Now, the darker strips are 3.2 or 3.6mm thick ply. These are the strips that were used to go underneath the unwinch track if there was a gap between the top part of the metal floor and where the track was going. I have repositioned the ones that I actually need to use where the unwinch track was going. Now you can see a row of holes at the back there with no wood on it at all. That's because those holes are pretty much at the top of the metal floor, the same along the back there. But closer to me you can see the darker strip of wood going along there. You can probably just mark out the holes there. They just simply space it out so that when the unwinch track is done up, it isn't trying to compress a gap. And that plywood, as I said, is 3.6mm, and there's 2 pieces, so it's just over 7mm, and that spaces out the indentation in that part of the floor with the top surface of the floor perfectly. The lighter colour pieces of wood are 18mm pieces of ply, and again, they fit in the crafter. There are 3 quite deep channels in the floor. 18mm fits that perfectly. And I'll just get a straight edge and show you what I mean. That straight edge is resting on the top or the uppermost parts of the metalwork, and also touching the ply, the 18mm ply, and the 2 pieces of a 3.2mm or 3.6mm ply, whatever it is. And at this part of the van, where the step is, where we're walking in and out, I want to put as much levelling or as much reinforcement to level it as possible. So I'm reusing all the bits of wood that came with the van effectively. Simply because I'm going to be using 25mm PIR insulation and the plywood on top of that. PIR is designed to be laid on a completely flat surface. It can take extraordinary amounts of weight when it's laid on a flat surface, but obviously in a van floor undulates. You've got all these areas here where there's a gap. Now I'm not going to go daft, I'm not going to fill every single channel in the floor with plywood, there's no need, but I am just simply doing a bit of load spreading, especially around the foot area, and I will be putting a piece in every single one of those channels in between the seats, because that is the area that's going to get the most foot traffic, there in this area here. The other one that really matters is that one down the centre, because that obviously is, I'm just spreading the weight out. Otherwise there will be effectively almost a 20mm gap for the flooring to potentially sink into over time, or crush the PIR down over time. The other furrings on the sides, less important. It's just that I've got the material, it was already cut to size, so I've used it. Now, let's talk about laying the floor itself. As I mentioned earlier in the previous video, this van, I keep saying hundreds of holes, it's dozens. There's a lot. I haven't actually counted them, but there are dozens and dozens. So you've got the large holes that the unwinds track was bolted through, and the vast majority of those now, I've used this plywood, I've spaced it out and sealed the holes up, and I've only retained the holes I intend to keep. So that piece there, that supports the underside of the, or rather it supports the plywood floor and helps to support the underside of the unwinds track, so it doesn't pull through the floor. The gooey bits on the left there, I've created some little valleys so that when I come to seal these holes up from underneath, I don't use too much goo. Those holes there, they're in the actual angle side of the flooring. Again, I will seal these underneath. And if you remember from the previous video, this is where the majority of the rust was. None of these holes have been sealed. You've got the wheel arch there, water being thrown forward. It was just getting up, forcing its way up past through these holes. I'd hate to have driven this thing through a Ford because it would have turned into a sieve. So I will be sealing all these holes from underneath, assuming I put the unwinds track back in along the full length, which I probably won't, but assuming I did, then once the bolts are through, I will be sealing the bolts and the thread as part of doing the nut up, because I don't want water finding its way back in the van to the degree it was. It was very obvious that water had been getting in this area around here. So, along here you can see I've simply used the plywood and I've staggered it and glued it down, and the holes that are here and the holes that were here are effectively now capped by this, and there's a complete seal using the PU40. I'll go over it from underneath again using the black stuff, but for the time being I've just glued it down with a bit of white. This piece of track here, this piece of plywood here, I've actually positioned this so it does line up with the holes underneath the van. I probably will use a small piece of the unwinds track here. This is going to be under the bed area because it might make a useful tie down. I haven't decided yet, but I've positioned the plywood so that if I do fit it back on, then the plywood lines up with the holes, and if I don't, then I'll be able to inject goo through those holes, and the insulation will sit on top of the ply, so it'll make a nice plug. In a crafter and a sprinter, you can see where that piece of plywood is there. That area is lower than this raised point here. If that wasn't supported by something, effectively a batten, then the flooring with weight on it could potentially bend slightly at the edges, and it's very prevalent there, at the back there, and there's a reasonably longish length here. Sorry, not there, you can see there's a rib there, but here. So these areas I'm also going to be supporting with strips of plywood, the same thickness, overall 7.2mm, just to make it level with that piece of metal there. And that will mean the floor is fully supported across the entire width, across the full width of the van. Now, something else to mention, the step. If you look at the previous videos, the floor in this van protruded out over the step there. You can probably just see there's a mark there where the original sealant was, and the same there. There's a mark, calibrated foot, there's a mark just about there. So the actual step into the van was pretty much not much wider than the width of the external step. I've got to give a bit of thought to what happens if I ever need to do anything to the runner for the sliding door. Getting that step cover off, and I've actually had this step cover off and I've cleaned it all out and lubricated and greased the bearings. This van's done very little mileage, so there isn't anything that's going to wear out under there in the immediate future. But let's say one day I needed to get this step up. I've got to think about how I lay this floor if I retain this smaller step entrance, and that provides me a larger floor area for mounting furniture on in this area here, by the sliding door. I've got to think about, do I ever need to get this plastic step up? And I'm going to have a little experiment to see if there's enough wriggle room to get it out. I think there is, providing I make the cheek pieces that go from the plywood floor down to the actual step removable. And they were originally in this van. It would have been a bit of faffing about, but they were designed so you could actually unscrew it all. But I'll have to give that a bit of thought. Now, the other thing I'm dealing with, which is going to be unusual for, if you had a van with a completely solid floor, I've never drilled a hole in it myself. I would bond and glue down the battens, and then lay the flooring on top of that and glue and screw and glue into the battens. But I'd never screw through the floor. But I have in this van, and you can see them there, rows and rows of screw holes. The original plywood flooring was screwed down. So in this instance, I'm going to use the original holes. I shall simply mark through the battens using the original ply to create a hole, which I can then drill on the pillar drill to make sure it's absolutely straight. And then I can screw the battens down and seal them into these existing holes. This isn't how it was originally built, because obviously I'm now putting battens down because I'm putting insulation on. Originally the plywood was just screwed straight down through these holes. I'll also use sealant around each one of these holes so that as the plywood clamps down, it actually seals the screw and prevents water penetration. There wasn't a great deal of water penetration through some of these holes, but it was noticeable. And I will show how that's going to work next. Ironically, there's fewer holes for that end of the sheet. There's only 4. But along here, look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 screws. And I've marked that one with a red arrow because there is something underneath there. The diesel tank is just below that red arrow. I've actually probed all these holes with a thick piece of wire to make sure that there's a good ½ inch of clearance. And the only one where it fouls something after about ½ inch is where those red lines are. So I'm going to be using slightly smaller screws, or they're only just about catching the metal. But all the others are clear. And I will do the same with all the rows. There's another row here, for example, there. There's a row of holes along there. I will test that they've all got a bit of depth, because I'm intending to use just straightforward, I think they're 40mm screws through the 25mm battens I'm using, 1½ inch or whatever they are, 1¼ inch. I've got a tear in the floor there. I can't remember what was there, but there's a tear in the floor there which I will fill with sealant. Very odd. But that's the initial battening done to support the floor and level it. And again, down there, chances are we'll never actually be walking through there because that's where the bed's going to be, but I've just extended those pieces of wood out so that it gives as much support to the plywood, or rather to the insulation and the plywood, as possible. Right, next job, let's start getting the cross battens in and start getting this flooring back down. So there we are, there's the basic principle I'm adopting. These are 25mm times 38mm standard UK roofing battens. They are pressure treated and they're ideal when dealing with 25mm thick PIR, because it's exactly the right size. If you buy PIR, plain or round timber, 25mm is going to come out 22, maybe even less. It's undersized. Rough sawn timber like this, roofing battens, is perfect. I used it throughout WAS, and I'm going to use it in this van. Now the only downside with buying this stuff is, yes, it's cheap. It comes in bundles. It's normally wet. So I've currently got 2 packs. This is one of them. They come in packs of 10, or at least the timber merchant I get them from provides me in packs of 10. They're 4.8 metres long, and the packs are wet when you open them up. Typically, they come straight out of the sawmill. The wood's virtually green and it's been pressure treated, so it's going to be wet. So I've got them clamped out. It doesn't take long. They dry out fairly quickly to the point where they're usable, and as long as you clamp them up while they're drying out, they're straight enough for this application. I wouldn't necessarily use them extensively for construction, although I did make the entire shower framing out of this stuff, but I had clamped them and I'd stored them for weeks to ensure they were straight. Unfortunately, these ones, although some of them were bent as banana when these turned up on Friday, just clamping them out in the sun like this, they've straightened out nicely. And just for the purpose of experiment, that is one full length, 4.8 metres. I've virtually used up an entire length there, just to frame that one area, which is the smallest section of floor. That was the most bent piece of wood, and the whole lot's straightened up beautifully. I was applying aluminium tape there and there, embedded into this section in line with where the end of the holes are for the Unwinds track. I've inserted a piece of 25 by 38 timber. It's directly above where the track will go. That's so that when the track is actually through the opening in the plywood, clamped down, this will clamp down properly straight down to the floor. Reason being, there's going to be seat belts on the seats. This needs to be bolted down properly. You can't have it squeeze in an air gap. And then the actual floor itself, as I said, is reused. You can see it's got, I think you can see, that's where the Unwinds track is actually a rooted recess. These 2 rails I will be using to secure the seat. These recesses here, which run the full length of the van, I will be filling in with wood once I've got the floor laid out. So for the time being, just to protect this insulation, I'm just going to be laying these sheets loosely. In roughly the right place, which is about sort of there-ish. And that will now allow me to prepare the other one and give me a safe area to stand on without damaging the insulation. And I'll just progress through the remaining 3 in a similar way. Once done, then I can insert the Unwinds track back into its recesses and start drilling some holes through the pieces of wood that I'm putting in as reinforcement. And I can then just make sure all the holes line up and then screw the floor down properly. And I do hope it's worthwhile reusing this. It's saving the best side of, I don't know, 3 sheets, £100, £120, depending. What does it cost? About £35 a sheet. It's saving the best side of £100 if I can reuse these sheets again. The downside is, where I peeled off the old vinyl, you can see the residue from the glue there. I hope I don't have trouble sticking the new flooring down, but we'll find that out. So there's the second piece installed. Same principle before. Cross framing and then support around the edges, support underneath, and a couple of pieces of timber laid in for the Unwinds track. And I've just realised I made a boo-boo. Yesterday I mentioned this step and the potential need to remove it. I don't know whether any knows, but these are actually held on by multiple screws, and I've had this one out, as you can see. There's little plugs here. You just drill a hole and use a screw, and you can pull the plugs out, and then you can get to the actual screws. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these plugs, and then there's is it? Can you see it? Yeah. Just down there, there's a Torx, I think it's T40 Torx screw. They're all T40 Torx screws, but the end result is you've got 7 screws to remove to get the step up. With those screws undone, you can raise the step enough to get access to the majority of the stuff underneath, and it's always worth taking these steps up and cleaning them when you're doing when you're using a second-hand van, because chances are there's loads of crap under there. This thing had syringes, plasters, all sorts of rubbish under there that I cleaned out, and then I was able to check the bearings and just you know, just overhaul it. But I noticed in the corner here there's a cutout in the metal there. I will cut this piece of wood back a bit further now that I, oops, fingers. I'll cut this bit of wood back further when I once this sealant's gone off. But there's a cutout in the step there. And with these screws undone, I think you could actually rotate this and it would actually slide up through that gap to get it out, and then you could stand it up an end. So I'll give a bit of thought to preserving that little slot there, so that if I should ever need to take this out, I can. But I think for 90% of the work you need to do, it will just be a case of undoing the screws and being able to lift it up high enough to get to the, I mean, the thing that's going to fail most likely will be the bearing on the end of that support arm there. It's very rare you need to get to the cabling, which is also in there, but it needs considering. Anyway, I'm now going to go get this piece of plywood and just lay that on there, and then I'll start on the third one. There's the last 2 sheets of insulation laid with a timber frame around the edges and support timbers where needed. I've added a couple of timbers there to support the unwinds track, because as you've either seen in the previous clip, or the clip was just about to come up, depending on when I edit it in, I've managed to identify a way of creating a seating area here, and that means I'll use a bit of the unwinds track to bolt a seat down to, and hence that piece of foil there is on top of a piece of timber. Same there, that's on top of the, well, that piece of timber there is the edging of the framework, but it just happens to also be directly in line with the holes for where the unwinds track will go. But that's the floor insulated. I won't be putting the foil tape round the complete edges until later on, because I'll do that as part of closing off the walls. If I put the foil tape down now, it'll only get in the way and get damaged, because I've got a bit of insulation to put all around the edges of this board. It's probably one of the few places I'll use some expanding foam just on the very edges, just to get some insulation down there in the gaps between the battens. But that's the floor pretty much built, and I'll be loose laying the plywood for quite a while, because I no doubt will be taking it up to modify or do other pieces of work. I also noticed, I mentioned earlier on about these projections that line up with the step. I've got them supported on blocks at the moment, because it sounds lost if I tread on that I'll snap it off. But I've also noticed that on the door, down there's 3 holes, and I thought, what are those 3 holes? And when you look up the door, there's 3 very similar looking holes and a dirty great rubber stop. So obviously what they've done is they've taken the stop off in order to allow for this projection here. I've just ordered a new stop. I think I'm going to actually recess this projection, or even cut it away. Wait and see. I think the stop will be more useful, because it means when you open the door, especially if you do it violently, there's a chance the door can sort of almost twist like that as it goes back, because the stop's missing. And just a point of note, they are different part numbers. That stop there is what, a couple of inches wide, the one at the bottom comes out a bit further. There's the unwinds track. I've just laid that piece in there just to line up the plywood and the other piece. Something also worth considering. I've only put these original pieces of flooring down. They're not screwed down and they're not permanently fixed yet. Here goes Molly. Hello Molly. You coming to see me? Jump. Good girl. That is because I will be trimming that projection to match the kitchen cabinets I build in here. And I may well be cutting that piece off at 45 degrees because I'm toying with the idea of staggering the bulkhead. So I'm not going to be fixing any of these sheets down permanently until I've actually cut them for, well, I suppose I could cut them into place. But there's something else to think about as well. You need access to the door to panel it. The edge of that sheet, Molly, I'm trying to film the sheet. That piece there that's covering the step, that's going to make it a little bit awkward to get to the bottom of the door to fix anything. So again, having that sheet out of the way when I come to do the door might be useful. Whether I actually manage to time it correctly or not, I don't know. I may end up with the floor fixed down and I'll just have to work around it. Or I may actually trim the door and insulate the door beforehand. But it's just something I've thought about as I've put that in place, thinking that's going to obstruct the door if I'm trying to work on it. Right. Open the door again. Go on Molly, go and find Susie. There's Susie. You coming in Susie? Right. What I've also done, now that I can stand in here, is I've mocked up the bed frame. I bought this ages ago because I wanted a strong metal frame. This was second hand on Facebook Marketplace, I think. I was originally planning to do a drop down bed from the ceiling. Far too much engineering and not enough head height. I thought maybe we could just squeeze underneath it, but the reality is it's too much prattling around. And having used Was, which is over there, we very much decided we want a fixed bed, and even the hassle of lowering something down and faffing about doesn't appeal. So I'm going to use a fixed bed, and originally I was going to do it lengthwise, but that comes out to where that black mark is there, halfway through the window, and pretty much half the entire available space in the van would have been taken up by the bed. That's too much space to lose. So I've mounted this frame. They do this a lot. It's great fun watching them play. They play and play and play and play, and we know they're playing because they sneeze at each other. So you may hear that in the background. This metal frame, conventional 4'6" wide double bed with a metal headboard and footboard. I've shortened this by maybe 3 inches. Actually a little bit more than that. No, I've taken about 3 inches off of it. And I've just got some battens bolted onto the wall. I will have to take another ½ inch or so off of this frame at a later date. But I've laid it on here and just so that I could satisfy myself that I can sleep widthwise. Karen's okay, she's shorter than me, but I tend to sleep stretched out. And I just wanted to make sure that I can do that on here. And by doing that, we save, well, what? There's about 2 feet there. That makes all the difference. It makes considerable difference to the way we can use this layout. As I was saying just now, this was going to be part of the electric drop down bed. That's why I wanted a metal frame. It's very, very strong. There's actually a steel beam all the way across. It's bolted. There's a double beam there that's bolted. And the slats are quite strong as well, obviously easily replaceable. But that now gives us the bed frame, and that changes what I can do with the van. The unwinds track that I was going to use there to mount the seat, I won't use now. I'll fill those gaps in with timber. What we can do now is put a seating area here against this window and a table. And I've actually got a seat out of a minibus, double seat with seat belts on. I can fit it so that it's facing the bed most of the time, and I will use this piece of unwinch track here and probably a short length of this one here to mount it on. We can have the seat facing that way for normal use, and a table, which may well be a pull-out table from about there. But the seat has seat belts on, and this track is properly, or will be, properly bolted back in again under the floor with spreader plates. And we can turn the seat around. Okay, somebody's sitting sort of in this area, will be looking at the back of the shower or the back of the toilet. But it does mean we can provide a seat belt for passengers should we ever need to. And it's always something I thought about, which is why I was actually thinking of putting the seats up the front originally. We were toying with the idea of having passengers. But the fact we've got this window here already, I had intended to cover this with furniture, but I now think I can get away with the shower up here and a cupboard that's going to house the freezer, or fridge rather, in this area here. It means we can make use of this window. And Karen was quite interested in getting as much light in this van as possible. We will be losing all this black plastic film that's on these windows as well, because it makes it very dark with the door slid back like that. You know, it's extremely dark. So there we go, quick mock-up. Just thought I'd film that because I'll be taking that out in a minute, and then I'm going to be lifting these boards up. I'm going to have to make some holes down here now, and add some reinforcing timbers underneath. I need to lift these boards up and put down the aluminium tape just to actually make a good vapour seal on the insulation. And then I'm going to start insulating the walls of the van using this bloody horrible recycled plastic bottle insulation that I bought. The stuff I bought from B&Q, far superior, much better stuff, and I will use as much of that as possible. But this stuff I got from Amazon is really coarse and horrible, and it doesn't, where is it, there, this stuff, it doesn't compress that nicely, which makes it a bit awkward to actually work with. It tends to bulge out. Have I got, yeah, there's a bit there. It's a reasonable thickness, but it bulges out everywhere, and I want it to, you know, compress in so that when I come to cover this in the sheet of thin ply, it doesn't push it out. So I'm going to use this stuff in the areas where it's going to be trapped, such as in here. It'll be captive inside there. Oh, it's good as insulation material. It's just tough. It's horrible stuff to cut. And then once I've used all that up, I shall go out and buy the softer, fluffy, nicer stuff that you can get from B&Q. On my Instagram page, I posted a photograph of the headrest, or to this bedstead. I think I could bolt it onto this back edge here, or maybe actually into the frame of the van itself, and that would create quite a useful ornamental grille, effectively, against these windows. We could still reach through and close the blinds and open the door, but if anybody smashed the windows, they'd have trouble getting in. And it also means that we could perhaps use it to prevent the dogs jumping through when the door's open. But we'll see about that.